Now we would like to go to the second guest speaker, Mr. Ian Goldring, that he will be taking this issue from a European perspective. So thank you very much, Ian.
Hi everyone, I'll stand up here so you can see me more easily. We'll just get the first slide. Just put the first slide, the cover slide, and I'll start with that. Everyone. One time I was doing this and the electricity cut out, so... Yeah, this one. Yeah, no, we've been doing these for a number of years now, and also if you count the ones we did before the publication of the book that were for research for doing this. But this time, what I've been asked to do is to take a look back and talk about how this NEET issue in the EU area has evolved and changed and morphed over time. What are all these changes? Well, next. That's it. Yeah, that's it right there. This is from 2007 to now, it's before the end of 2021. That's how the NEET levels in Europe have evolved. Now, it's not like there's no change at all, but you can see it's a relatively stable relationship. It goes up a bit, down a bit, up a bit, and that's it. They haven't really moved at all. One thing you might notice is that after the crisis of the pandemic, it took about 2 years to get back to the pre-pandemic levels of employment and activity. And after the great financial recession, 2007-8, it took about 8 years. So what you're saying is there's a kind of stable core that just never goes away. Issues that are playing out, like right now, is with the pandemic, there's something called hysteresis, or the common term is scarring, how that has affected long-term employment, but also educational possibilities. Something very interesting they did in the States, and I refer to this one because I'm aware of no such equivalent thing in Europe. The Americans did a study of all the children in school at different levels in the country to see how their performance levels had been affected by the whole period of lockdown and not going to regular school and so on. And what they found was that all levels of attainment had gone down, but of course, those in less advantaged areas or backgrounds went down much, much more. And also, capacities in math and sciences were the most reduced. Yeah? Generally because families are less equipped to teach that at home. Like a parent might read a book to a child before going to sleep or something, but they usually don't do like math exercises, right? So what you see throughout this whole period is continual discussion of issues of divergence, polarization, inequality between different social groups or places or different job sectors or more or less advantaged or disadvantaged people. And this is this continual debate. What you're seeing now that the rates are going back down a bit, there's a return to focus on those who are what they say furthest from the labor market, more difficult to help them integrate into it. Before the pandemic hit, like a buzzword in Brussels was people talking about job carving and so on. This was meant to be an innovative approach to helping those who are in a much more difficult to employ or activate situation. And this will be the trend now. Also, they made it the Year of Youth to emphasize how important they thought it was, largely because the situation was so bad. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just the same thing over time to give you a bit of view in terms of geography. Again, you see the same thing. There is some shift from one image to another, but nothing really major has changed. Okay, next. And this is just the data broken down by country. Obviously, we're not going to look at all this now, but you can look at it later if you're interested to see where your country is and so on. You see roughly the same thing. Some countries have much more of it than others, but within each country, the variation tends to be fairly modest. Okay, next. So this is the same thing, but broken down for males. Next. And that's for females. What you tend to see in some cases, like in Turkey, there's a very big difference, as my colleague said, between the male and female NEET levels, right? In other countries, not so much. But what you do see, whatever the relationship is, it doesn't change a lot year to year. It changes somewhat, but nothing really decisive ever happens. So next. This also might seem counterintuitive. I'm talking about aging in a conference about young people. But one of the key things you have to understand if you want to talk about the NEET issue on a societal level, this problem for young people is a problem for society as a whole, and much more so because there's this very stable trend, which also has not changed over this period of time, of society getting gradually older, which means more old people and less young people, which affects something you have to understand called dependency ratios. And that means how many people are working in society to support how many people are not working. It's a fundamental figure. And these ratios are gradually going down and down, which means less people working to support more people not working. Okay, you add to that a smaller youth population, which will be the working population, and then you add that if they're having all these problems with NEET situations, et cetera, this is going to reduce their productivity, which will reduce their capacity to support this dependency ratio, which is already being squeezed. So in the long term, this is a very, very significant problem for all our societies. It's just that it's playing out in slow motion. But it hasn't stopped this whole time. It's like this thing that's just squeezing very slowly. Okay, next. This is an older chart, but I thought it was easier to understand than the other one, which is the most recent thing from Eurostat. Also, it has Turkey here, so you can see what's happening. Turkey, as the lady said, is much younger, but it's also entering into this aging dynamic as well. Yeah, just maybe not as much as some others. Yeah? Next. Gender issues. The trend throughout this period until the pandemic was that gender inequality in various aspects was broadly going down. Yeah? And then what happened during the pandemic, largely due to issues of home care type stuff, be it for children or older people, whatever, and females being disproportionately involved in care in the home, that kind of thing, the gains over this period of time were essentially reversed. So the question that's now being looked at, and we don't have the answer, maybe after some of you can enlighten us, is as things settle down, will this just automatically flip back to where it was before as a temporary blip, or will it take a similar amount of years to claw back these relative gains? Now, I don't have the answer. That's the question being asked right now. Also, you see, with job loss for the pandemic, it was women in low-paid jobs that were the biggest group to become unemployed. This is because, like, if you're a waitress or something like that, then it wasn't a good time to be a waitress, right? What tend to happen is that men tend to be much more distributed across different types of job sectors. So they're not as like if you were in one of the sectors where everything closed down and you lost your job. Well, lots of other things, just nothing happened really, yeah? And men tend to be more like spread out. But conversely, what you're seeing right now in the EU, it's women who are getting the majority of new well-paid employment. So it's not all of a negative story. Next. Okay, if any time in the last maybe several years or so, if any of you possibly have maybe ever felt a bit down, maybe a little worried or stressed about something, now you can be sure that you are not alone. These are the levels of increase in anxiety, depression, and the increase in the use of antidepressant drugs. Yeah, over this time period, yeah? And it's a big deal. It's a big deal. Yeah, you can see a pretty good range of countries here. Yeah, what this has coincided with, if you work at youth work or employment-related issues, the third sector, is an increase in the awareness of the importance of mental well-being. That this is actually a very serious subject, and it's started to filter more and more into how people design their practice and what they do. For example, I was recently doing some work with the Slovenian Public Employment Service, and one of the things they had been doing was giving training to their staff to become more aware of and to better be able to recognize and cope with people with signs of anxiety and depression amongst the people who come into these employment centers, so as to be able to do their work better, because this is really an issue. And what I'm saying is this kind of awareness tends to be filtering into practice a lot at present. Next. So this is sort of the bottom line, this one slide here. Whenever you get an economic crisis, youth are consistently the group that's the worst hit, okay? It's not just job losses, though that is very significant. if you look at it, there are also issues of housing insecurity, people not knowing how they're going to have a place to live or maintain it, pay the rent, etc. Basically poverty, difficulty making ends meet just means poverty. And now you're seeing like Eurofund and these organizations look a lot more at issues of energy poverty, which are emerging, particularly somewhere like Belgium where I live, it's a big deal. At the high point of the pandemic, it was considered that about 2/3 of the young people in the EU were at risk of depression. Now, this has gone down since the high point, but the levels are really, really quite high. So what you're seeing is a situation that sort of oscillates. It goes from bad to less bad, but not really great, yeah? You also get an issue now of unmet healthcare needs because people haven't been going to get these things attended to and so on. And this is a generalized thing, and the services, there's a big backlog in providing medical services. Younger women are a group at particularly high risk for health issues due to this unmet medical need. Yeah, but it is a generalized problem in society. I'm not suggesting it's only them. So what you get is during the pandemic, there was a hope, like a lot of economists would speculate about this, that once it was over and someone sort of declared, that's it, there would be a kind of bounce back reaction. People would be sort of joyous and like good news, you know. And it didn't happen, this sort of rebound or bounce back. People were glad that it was over, but it was this kind of bad, less bad thing, yeah? Largely to do with other economic issues, inflation, what's going on in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. There is, in a sense, of things really substantially getting a lot better. Okay, next. Okay, just to give you some examples here. This is, if you look up here, the top one is issues of mental health care requirements. Now, these are the different age groups, like younger to older. You see the biggest one here is for the youngest group. The second highest level of mental health well-being issues is in the second youngest group. And of course, what you see with older people, there are more issues of what you might expect, like heart disease, cancer, things like that, not so much young people, yeah? But so you look at that, that's the point. The whole mental health well-being thing, it's a serious issue. Next. And I was glad that this other person talked about that as well, because this issue of trust is and I find it quite disturbing personally, a factor associated with the NEET situation. They tend to have declining trust and engagement levels. This can be with institutions and politics and stuff like that you talked about, but also just in other people, like trusting and engaging with just other people like us, yeah? And this is disturbing enough, but what happened with the pandemic, and this is why I put this subtitle, Water on Wet. During the pandemic, levels of trust in society decreased in all groups. Even people who are normally in the most optimistic sort of range or quintile, they all went down. Even the best off people in society became more mistrustful. So if you've got a group of people who are already suffering with this issue of trust, this has been a very, very unhelpful time for that. Boom, boom. Yeah? What happened? What's going on here, man? Why am I looking at Dutch? What's going on? Make it go away, make it go away. Escape. What are you doing? Yeah. Well, anyway, conversely, trust in the EU, on the most part, has gone up. It bucked the trend. And to be fair, also, youth, generally speaking, are not the age group with the lowest trust levels, overall speaking. The NEET group is a particular problem, though, yeah? And just to give you a quick idea, this is something intuitively you probably already know. Low trust levels tend to correspond people who don't get vaccinated, people who get their news from social media, people who are farthest from the labor market, which is a very polite expression, and basically people with economic problems, people who are poor, okay? Which, you would think makes sense. Next. Yeah. Here are just some of these levels to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Now, this is trust in the EU. Here you see them mostly going up. Here, this is young people. So you see a beginning of optimism during the period of the pandemic, and then some disappointment kicking in. So not perfect, but on the whole, fairly solid. These are the same groups and their trust in their national government institutions. So these people would very much like to have what these people have right now. In the political class throughout Europe, they're aware that there are declining trust levels in them. So this affects the kind of discourse you see about just transition and this kind of thing that's become very popular to talk about. And just to give you another comparison here, you get different trust levels by sector. So healthcare, police, and government. So government's not doing so well in terms of trust. Yeah? Next. Normally when I was doing these talks, what we were doing is not so much this history of NEET situation thing, but rather talking to people who work in what we loosely call the youth sector, which is a lot of different things, how best and how most effectively to address, help, and support people in NEET situations, or hopefully to help them not get into a NEET situation. The real kernel of the idea is that when we talk about NEET situations, you have to know that NEET is an umbrella term for a whole bunch of different things that are caused by a wide range of different things. So you cannot have an approach to NEET situations because there is no such thing. It's like a kind of buffet of a lot of different things going on that we call a buffet or NEET situations, yeah? So these are the main correlating factors with ending up in a NEET situation. They're very different, you'll see, yeah? For example, education's the biggest one. So educational failure, dropping out, or some kind of inadequacy with the education, right? Then you get immigration backgrounds, or in many cases it might be an ethnic minority, like maybe in the East, more like Roma minorities and things like that. Health issues, be it physical or mental, and the mental thing is really on the up. Family issues, so it can be divorce or some kind of instability, a problem in the home, which then reflects into other areas of life. Unemployment, which is, you would think is obvious, like environments where, say, the father doesn't work, or in an area where there's not a lot of employment, or what they call intergenerational transmission of employment, and so on. And household income, this is just saying being poor. Being poor is a very good way to end up being a NEET. And location issues. This can be a few different things. It can be maybe you're in a small rural village somewhere, maybe in, I don't know, eastern rural Romania, somewhere like that, with not a lot of opportunity, but it might also be a deprived area or neighborhood of an urban center, yeah? But the point is, where you are is a disadvantage to you in some way. And of course, no. And of course, with all these problems, you can also have more than one problem at a time. The bottom line to take away is that depending how you got into a NEET situation, what you would want to do for that person is going to be very different. Like, if I'm in a wheelchair, you know, what you might do for the person who's coping with their parents' divorce or something like that, that's not really very helpful to me, and so on and so forth. That's the whole point, yeah? And this might seem really obvious when you say it, but when I started working with this, it was like 10, 12 years ago or something now, you would have these discussions going in circles that no one ever got an answer to because, well, what's the best thing to do for a NEET situation? There is no answer to that question because it's the wrong question, because there are all these different NEET situations, okay? Next. Okay, this is another thing we talk about, how you approach this. Some of you might have met this person. He comes to all these SALTO events and so on. He's a psychologist in Lithuania. So being in a NEET situation is a kind of trauma. You look at psychologically, maybe to different degrees depending how bad it is, but it's what in psychology would be referred to as a trauma experience, okay? The general principle for treating a trauma, what is it? The idea is that essentially you give the person the opposite experience of what the traumatic experience was. So if the person was experiencing isolation, you would try to give them connection. If they're experiencing rejection, which is typical for job seekers, you try to give them acceptance, yeah? If they're feeling excluded, well, included, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. That's a sort of general, very vague guiding principle. Next. Now, normally this is where we spent more time in these presentations about like what different types of youth work can do and what different presentations approaches can be. So, but we're doing the history thing today, but I wanted to include, just to give you a kind of key to the book. We had all these different causal factors that we identified, so what we tried to do is find examples of different youth work activities and approaches that address these different things. For example, this here is for people with disabilities in Poland, if they're seeing or hearing difficulties. This is about immigrants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, yeah? And where we got them was in events like this. I went around with Maria for years before the book ever came out, looking for people in the audience who were addressing these or knew someone who did, because we wanted to be very much a focus on the ground on a practical level of how they were dealing with this. In many cases, they hadn't thought that they had a practice that was addressing needs. It did, they just didn't think of it in that conceptual framework, yeah? So we had a range of practices to give you an idea of what variety there might be and could be considered a NEET-related practice. Next. And also we tried to identify what were the causes for these different approaches being successful. In some cases, the people involved liked this exercise because they hadn't thought through themselves, really, how come this is working. They just sort of found that it did. Now, this can be interesting. For example, there's a Romanian one which was very good about addressing young people in a rural environment. It was very good practice, but maybe you're not really working with rural youth and that's not your problem. But what you also might find is the principle that made it successful might be useful. For example, in this case, what the Romanians did was very smart in how they worked with the local stakeholders to get approval for this project they wanted to carry forward and get support amongst the local community that they were trying to get involved. And so you could be in a very different environment, but sort of learn a thing or two from that approach to stakeholder activation, yeah? So we don't have time. Normally I would go through all these one by one, but that's not what we're here to do today. But I wanted to give you just a sense of how to use the book. So just next. Yeah, and this is going through the various aspects and principles that we extracted from. You're going to have to just read the book, I hope. But what you can keep in mind, you can jump around. I made it so that you could, like if you're interested, say, in the rural example, you can go to that case study and read it. And I always tried to ask them at the end, well, why does this work? And what advice would you give to someone who wants to do something similar somewhere else? So it's really a focus on a practical how-to approach. We're often on all these things with the OECD, they give like a little description of it, but you wouldn't be able to go out and do it yourself based on that. So that's what I was at least trying for. Next. Anyway, someone told me that my presentation was very depressing. So I thought, well, oh yeah, I can understand that reaction, yeah? But I wanted to close on something a bit more positive. We're talking all this depression and long-term damage, and it's awful, yeah? Even if people go through these experiences that we might say are traumatic or negative or unhelpful, it's not like that's it. The rest of their lives are just, you can write them off, yeah? Something bad can happen or something undesirable, let's say, and that doesn't mean the story's over. You can go back on track. That's the sort of play on words that we've always been working with in this long-term project. And that's sort of what hopefully everyone here can be a part of that story, sort of moving forward, back on track. And this is where I say thank you to everyone. This is my data, and I try and speak Turkish. I go, teşekkür, yeah? Is it okay? And that's it. That's my presentation. And now I'll just stop there if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Ian. And if you would like him to sign your books, you know, that he wrote this book. Now, he will be available tomorrow from 1:30 to 2 o'clock in front of the Mayan. Just kidding. So any questions? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Not is exactly one question, is one reflection that I can observe in the other presentation and in this presentation. Normally, is the question of the poverty, employment, gender equality, autonomy, geographical situation, the contrast urban to rural, or the minorities. Is the same problem when we are promoting the participation, for example, in the European programs. Is the same situation that is one barrier, is one problem in order to facilitate opportunities for the young people. He's in Turkey, but it's the same in different countries in the European Union. If one younger have the problem of autonomy, employment, poverty, gender equality, autonomy, geographical situation, it's really difficult that he or she have the opportunity to participate like us in one seminar like this.
Yeah.
This is the great problem.
Yeah. Those are the people that are politely called further from the labor market in some of the jargon. Yeah, that's right. And one thing you got to know about this whole issue about trust and engagement, if you're trying to engage with young people, like often the kind of person, no, I'm not knocking this, but you know when you see these like youth parliaments they do and stuff like that, where they go, and they recreate like a parliament, but young people go and, you know, hear their voice. Those young people, don't worry about them. They're fine. And I'm happy for them. I'm not criticizing them, yeah? Because NEET situation, young people, they don't go to stuff like that. And also, if you want to get young people involved, because it's a thing, like say with European voluntary scheme, one of the things we looked at in the book is how do you engage with NEETs? Because the whole idea of volunteering, and being engaged or disengaged and mistrustful, they don't go together. It's just not the obvious, who volunteers. So there's a whole, if you're going to try and address this sort of NEET situation with something like a volunteering experience, or where they go away to another country for a period of time, what you have to do, and where people were successful with this, we looked at in Slovakia and Estonia, they had some examples, yeah? There's a preparatory phase before that prepares them for it. It's very important that it goes well, because if it goes badly for them, it'll just make their attitudes much worse. They'll go, see, I tried to do this and it was awful, particularly with people who have special disability needs, like they're in a wheelchair or something. And also there has to be a plan for when they come back. So you don't just sort of shoot them off, and it's part of a larger pathway that's being designed. And when this was being approached in that way, this is when they were getting better results. And that was, say, when I had before, like the different factors of success, that would be one of the things that would be in there.
Thank you.
I can do it all. I have two things.
Oh shit, am I on camera? I have two things, a note and a question. What do you want first? The note or the question?
I guess the note. Yeah.
The note, and that's in case you were talking about trauma. I just want to give a short note. I don't know if you know the documentary Wisdom of Trauma of Gabor Mate. I think it's very useful for everybody. It was an eye-opener for me. It says that dealing with trauma is already in the trauma itself. It's the wisdom that you can gain out of your trauma. It's very special. And my question to you was, do you see a change in the level of coping mechanism that the young people have now in their backpack, and comparing to, what would you say, 25, 30 years ago?
Well, the first thing I thought was maybe I should have said that instead of the cute picture of the smiling train. And I'm not in a position to say how people were coping 25 years ago or today. It's not, I mean, I would just be sort of making it up. I haven't seen, I mean, have you seen any indication of that one way or the other?
I'm working now in special education for 30 years, and I think there is a change. And
How so?
It would be too long. I didn't research it, but I think in basic skills, like communication skills, especially this stupid thing, is a big negative factor in this, I think. And 25, 30 years ago, we could talk with kids around the table, and now I think you're a great guy if you can get kids around the table.
Yeah. Okay, we got to stop there because I think someone wanted to. Yeah.
I'm here.
I got to stop.
Yeah, I'll just.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, then.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Your presentations are always, very attractive, let me say. Since I am in this NEET issues, lots of birds are flying in my mind. And one of them is, I'm a university professor. When I look at from macro perspective, I see that there are also generational issues. This is the first time in human history that 6 different generations are living together. And when we look at these NEET people, they are from Z generation. And of course, their values are different, like freedom, independence. As a business professor, I think that these are also related to workplaces, their values. Most of the time, for example, as a university professor, I changed my mind and my mission. More than teaching, what I'm trying to do is coaching. So that's helping them to show their potential. So I don't know if there is something project or thing related to coaching to NEET people or people who are working with NEET people. I have never heard that kind of topics, during these meetings, conferences. What do you think about this business perspectives? For example, when we look at here, there is no one from private sector as well who can also be a stakeholder from that perspective. What do you think about this?
Well, one thing that's interesting, it's because it's not just young people, not just how young people are changing, but it's how you're changing. Yeah, it's all the people around young people. How are they changing too? Europe and Turkey altogether, it's a pretty big place. So there's a lot of scope for a lot of very different experiences of youth. So I'm not really wanting to say something sweeping about what it's like to be young today, being my age. It's ridiculous. But one thing I think that is pretty obviously important is that there's a generation, since they've been really aware of society in any larger sense, has been nothing but one ongoing crisis after another. They're the sort of double whammy generation. And that's got to really affect their attitudes to a whole bunch of things. Like you see attitudes to democracy, sort of dysfunctionality. Maybe it makes them more keen to protest, maybe less keen. But the experience of this long-term, sustained crisis of some kind, like they've never really known anything since maybe they were, like if you were, let me see, in 2007, if you were 15, 16, 18, let's say you were 15. How old are you now? 2007, so it'll be what? 3, then 2010, 12, so that's 15 years. So you're 30. Yeah, if you were 15, 2007, you're now 30. And that whole period has been one long crisis. So that's got to be significant. But I may be more interested to hear what some of you might have to say about that.
So we will take one last, just to remind you that we will have time for especially that you sharing your experience, your knowledge, information, that we will have several different occasions. And I will take one last question for Ian about his presentation. Then we will proceed, because like we have short in time here, and this is just like sharing some, how can I say, like a sparkling information to switch your own ideas on. So we will continue, don't worry. We have 2 days more.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, for a great presentation. I would like to comment a little bit about the trauma and how we should meet young people's needs, because in Iceland we are now suffering from this in the way that we have all the psychologists in Iceland has been diagnosing the young people, putting label on them, and there is no one left to treat them. So we are just labeling the young people, and it is not empowering them. I am always meeting young people who are waiting to be cured by the health system, but there are no such treatment. So I think we have to talk openly about it, how important it is to meet traumatized people without labeling them, and because it is not empowering. And I just want to say to those who was talking before, because we talked as everyone, women are higher in the NEET group, but it is not in Iceland. In Iceland, 9.2% of young women are in NEET, but 9.8% of men. So the men are a little bit higher in Iceland.
Yeah, that's important. It's not automatically always the women who are the highest. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So in Iceland, men are oppressed, and we don't know.
Oh no, but there are a lot of places. Like if you look at the crisis 2007, a lot of it was based on construction. So you would have that would mostly be men. So all this construction stopped, and you had all these unemployed young men, right? Whereas a lot of women maybe were working in retail, like jobs that didn't pay great, but that didn't just close down all of a sudden. So like in that period, you had massive young male unemployment. Yeah.
And of course, like it's changing from any different country to country with different reasons. Sometimes like you have less rates, but if you ask that if there's an equality in terms of the salaries or the income, there are some other factors as well. Like there might be like differences, like more young people can be employed, but we don't know if they have a decent job, decent salaries, if they can still really afford their life in a decent way. That's once we can resolve this NEET issue a bit more, we can come to that point as well, because it's a huge maybe just a small portion of the iceberg, but it's a starting point for us to work with young people to involve them in society more, that's starting from the situation of need. Thank you very much, Ian, for a great presentation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. And
Thank you.